Picture this. You've worked your whole life. You've earned your success. And today, you're standing at the airport with a first-class ticket in your hand. The line is long. The voice is loud. But you know your place is secure. And then it happens. The agent looks at you, rips your ticket in half, and says words that sting deeper than any cut. Not for people like you. In that moment, what would you do? Lower your eyes and accept the humiliation. Walk away and pretend it didn't happen. Or take a stand, knowing the cost could be enormous, but so could the change. This is not just a story about a flight. It's about Dr. Serena Caldwell, a black CEO who chose not silence, not surrender, but action. One phone call later, she didn't just claim her seat. She grounded the entire airline. And now, I want to ask you, if it had been you, what would you have done? Stay with me, because this isn't only her story. It could be yours. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss stories that make you feel, reflect, and remember. The late afternoon sun filtered through the wide glass panels of Liberty International Airport in Newark. Travelers moved in restless waves, dragging suitcases, clutching phones, rushing toward their gates. Among them walked a woman whose presence was calm, centered, and unmistakably composed, Dr. Serena Caldwell, 44 years old, moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of discipline and hard work. She wore a navy blue suit, tailored but not flashy, a leather tote slung over her shoulder, and in her hand, a boarding pass for seat 1A in first class. It was a small symbol, but for her, it meant more than just extra legroom or champagne. It meant she had earned her place every step, every sacrifice. As she approached gate C-17, she noticed the usual cluster of passengers forming a line. Some were fidgeting with boarding passes, some scrolling on phones, others sneaking glances at her. Serena was used to that. Being a black woman in spaces where people didn't expect her, corporate boardrooms, negotiation tables, now premium cabins, always drew eyes. She had learned to ignore the whispers, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. The gate agent, a woman with sharp blonde hair and a practiced, dismissive smile, looked down at Serena's pass. Her name tag read Monica Hale. Monica frowned. "Ma'am, this isn't your boarding group. Economy is down the hall." Serena offered a polite smile. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "I believe it is. This is first-class boarding." She handed the pass forward. Monica took it between her fingers, glanced at the bold print Seat 1A First Class. For a moment, her eyes narrowed. Then, in one deliberate motion, she ripped the boarding pass in half, the paper tearing loudly, the sound cutting through the hum of the waiting area. Passengers gasped. A teenager pulled out her phone, already recording. Monica's lips curled in something between a smirk and contempt. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but first class isn't for people like you. You'll need to step aside." Serena stood frozen, the torn paper still fluttering in her hand. For an instant, the scene blurred the lights of the terminal, the whispers, the pointed stares. She was no longer a CEO, no longer the head of a multi-billion-dollar tech company. She was simply a black woman being told she did not belong. Her chest tightened, and in that moment, she was 10 years old again. Memory surged. She stood in line at a small diner in Georgia with her mother, waiting to order 2 milkshakes. She remembered the way the cashier had leaned over, ignoring her mother completely, serving the white customers behind them. She remembered her mother's trembling hands, the quiet humiliation in her eyes as she led Serena out of the diner, whispering, "It's fine, baby. We'll make something at home." Even as a child, Serena knew it wasn't fine. That night, she promised herself she would become someone no one could ignore. And yet, decades later, here she was publicly humiliated in front of strangers. A middle-aged man in line muttered under his breath. Not quietly enough, I guess she tried to sneak into first. Happens all the time. Another passenger, Rachel Kim, a young professional with an overnight bag, pulled out her phone and whispered, "This isn't right. I need to record this." She felt anger rising, even though it wasn't her fight. Serena's pulse pounded, but her expression did not break. She inhaled, long and slow, and spoke with a steadiness that silenced the murmurs around her. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Her words were not shouted. They carried no arrogance. Instead, they landed heavy, like a stone in still water, rippling outward. Monica rolled her eyes. Someone about to miss her flight. The gate printer spat out another boarding pass, this time stamped 14C Economy Plus. Monica shoved it across the counter. "Take this, or don't board at all." Serena looked down at the flimsy slip of paper. Row 14, middle seat, Economy Plus. The exact opposite of the place she had purchased and rightfully earned. She reached for it, not because she accepted it, but because she understood something bigger was unfolding. She knew every movement now mattered: the way she picked up the pass, the way she turned away, the way she held herself upright as she walked down the jet bridge. The world was watching. Phones were recording, and humiliation, she had learned long ago, could be turned into power if you knew how to carry it. As she stepped onto the aircraft, silence greeted her. First-class passengers glanced up, indifferent, already sipping champagne. She walked past them slowly, each step heavy, each gaze a reminder of exclusion. By the time she reached row 14, the sting of humiliation had crystallized into something sharper: resolve. She folded what remained of her torn pass and slipped it into her leather tote. Not as trash, as evidence. In her chest, a steady voice rose. This is not the end of the story. Not today. Not ever. She sat down, pulled out her phone, and opened her encrypted folder of contacts. Her thumb hovered over a name: David Ross, Chief Legal Officer. The plane hummed as passengers stowed luggage, oblivious to the storm about to begin. Serena's expression was calm, but her eyes carried fire. In 30 minutes, the humiliation at gate C-17 would spark a chain reaction that no one in Aurora Airlines could have imagined. And it would begin with just one call. The engines hummed faintly outside as passengers settled in. But Serena Caldwell barely noticed the bustle of the cabin. She sat upright in her seat in row 14, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the torn boarding pass tucked away in her tote bag. Outwardly, she was composed, almost serene, but inside her thoughts moved like quicksilver. Humiliation had followed her before, but each time she had found a way to transmute it into something larger. She had learned long ago that rage alone could not sustain her. What sustained her was discipline, the small, deliberate acts repeated day after day, year after year. That discipline was the foundation beneath everything she had built. Her mind drifted back to her morning, just a few hours earlier, before the storm. Serena rose at 5, as she did every day. Her apartment on the 37th floor of Sky Point Tower in Manhattan overlooked the Hudson River. Dawn light seeped into her kitchen as she poured a single cup of black coffee into her chipped ceramic mug, the one piece of her student days she had never replaced. She set the mug on the counter and opened the notebook she kept beside the window. 3 pages, every morning. She wrote them without fail. Not goals, not grand declarations, just the churn of her mind, the scraps of worry, the flickers of hope. Some mornings the pages were full of strategy for board meetings. Other mornings they were raw confessions of exhaustion. This morning she had written of anticipation. Today begins the next chapter. She had scrawled, her handwriting sharp and even. The acquisition is within reach. Afterward she slipped on running shoes and descended into the quiet streets of Lower Manhattan. She ran 3 miles along the riverfront, breath-sinking with footsteps, body attuned to rhythm. She liked the sensation of the city waking behind her, the rumble of early trucks, the hiss of street sweepers, the first waft of bagels toasting in corner shops. Running reminded her she belonged to the city, not just to boardrooms and contracts. Back upstairs showered, hair pulled into a sleek bun. She had stood before the mirror for a brief moment, not to admire herself, but to steady herself. Behind her reflection she could see the framed photo of her parents in Georgia, smiling in a churchyard. She had whispered softly, "I'll carry you with me." By the time she arrived at the airport, Serena had already moved through hours of careful rituals that grounded her. What she hadn't known was how those rituals would be tested. The image of Monica Hale ripping the boarding pass still replayed in her mind, sharp as broken glass. Serena let the anger touch her briefly, then released it. She had learned not to cling too tightly to rage. Rage burned hot and fast. What she needed now was clarity and patience. She turned her head slightly. Noticing the passenger across the aisle, a young woman with straight dark hair, phone balanced in her hands. The woman, later she would learn her name was Rachel Kim, had been recording from the gate. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Rachel gave a small nod, as if to say, "I saw what they did. You're not alone." It was enough. Serena offered the faintest smile. The flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, their voices clipped, professional, unaware of the storm brewing in the mind of the woman seated quietly in 14C. Serena's phone buzzed once in her palm. A reminder, final prep, merger call tonight at 8 p.m. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, orchestrating a deal worth billions, yet being told moments ago that she didn't belong in seat 1A. Her father's words rose in her memory. He had been a high school teacher, stern but loving. "Serena," he used to say, "power isn't about shouting the loudest. Power is about standing so steady that no one can shake you." She straightened her posture. She knew what was required. 30 minutes, she thought. In 30 minutes, the same airline that had tried to push her down would find itself on its knees. But the weight of that decision pressed on her chest. Was she ready to pull the lever that could stop hundreds of flights, strand thousands of passengers, rattle financial markets? A part of her whispered, "Maybe it's too much. Maybe you should just let it go this once." But then another memory surfaced, clear and raw. She was 22, newly hired at her first firm. At a client dinner, a senior partner had introduced her not as our analyst, but as the girl we brought along. Laughter had rippled around the table. She had smiled then, swallowing the sting. But that night she had promised herself never again would she swallow it. If disrespect appeared, she would meet it head on. Serena looked around the cabin. The man beside her scrolled lazily through sports highlights. Across the aisle, Rachel was pretending to read, but kept glancing up, her phone half hidden. Life went on, oblivious to the silent war raging in row 14. She opened her tote and carefully unfolded the torn boarding pass. The edges were jagged, the ink smeared from where Monica's nails had pressed too hard. She held the two halves together, imagining them whole again. It was more than paper now. It was proof. It was a symbol of how fragile dignity could appear and how resilient it truly was. She slipped the pieces back into her bag, alongside her laptop. Her hand rested briefly on the device. She had the credentials, the access, the leverage. Aurora Airlines had underestimated her gravely. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from David Ross. Her chief legal officer board meeting confirmed tomorrow. Let me know if you need escalation sooner. She typed a brief reply. Sooner. Stand by. Her thumb hovered for a moment before pressing send. A ripple of doubt passed through her. She imagined the passengers delayed, the headlines about grounded flights, the accusations of overreach. But then she remembered the gas at the gate, the way people's eyes had scanned her like she was an imposter. She remembered her mother's trembling hands decades ago, leading her out of that diner. This was no longer just about a seat on a plane. It was about something larger, something systemic. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing takeoff preparations. Serena closed her eyes, breathing evenly, letting the hum of the engines vibrate through her chest. She had been underestimated before. She had been dismissed, belittled, overlooked. But she had built her life on turning moments of dismissal into fuel for transformation. Her mind sharpened. She began to count the steps ahead. 1 call, 30 minutes, evidence gathered, escalation triggered. She could already see the dominoes lining up, ready to fall. When she opened her eyes again, they were clear and steady. Whatever doubt lingered had burned away. She whispered under her breath, just loud enough for herself. You tried to deny me a seat, but you gave me the whole airline instead. In that quiet declaration lay the truth. The humiliation at Gate C-17 was no ending. It was the ignition spark, and Serena Caldwell was ready to light the fire. The plane trembled slightly as it taxied toward the runway. Serena Caldwell kept her eyes closed, but her mind had drifted far away from the cabin. She wasn't in row 14 anymore. She was back in the deep south, in a one-story brick house with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked whenever the wind picked up. She could almost hear the hum of cicadas, the laughter of neighborhood kids riding their bikes past the yard, and the stern but reassuring voice of her father calling her name from the kitchen door. Serena had been born into a world that told her, in subtle and not so subtle ways, where she did not belong. Her childhood in Macon, Georgia, was marked by warmth inside her home and hostility outside of it. Her parents worked tirelessly, her father teaching high school history, her mother managing a small community library. They filled her life with books, music, and lessons on dignity. But the outside world had other lessons waiting. She remembered her first day of kindergarten, when a teacher assumed she was in the wrong classroom. Sweetheart, the preschool is down the hall, the woman had said, without looking twice. Serena had lifted her chin and replied, No, I belong here. It was a phrase that would follow her through life, I belong here. Her earliest wound came at age 10, at that diner in Georgia. She could still feel the heavy silence that followed when the cashier ignored her mother, choosing instead to serve a line of white customers. The way her mother's eyes had filled with hurt, the way her small hand had been gripped too tightly as they left. Serena had not cried then, but that night she had whispered into her pillow, One day, no one will treat us like we are invisible. By high school, she had already turned humiliation into fuel. While others her age filled afternoons with games and dances, she buried herself in books law, economics, history. She remembered evenings sitting at the kitchen table with her father, who would lean forward, tapping his knuckles on the wood for emphasis. "Serena, knowledge is armor. They may try to strip you of respect, but they can never strip you of what's in here." He tapped his temple. She excelled, but even excellence was met with suspicion. At a statewide debate competition, when she won first place, a judge muttered, "She's good for where she comes from." Those words had carved themselves deep into her. Not good, but good for where she comes from. She had smiled politely and shaken his hand. But inside she had made another vow. "I will be so undeniable they will have no choice but to see me for what I am, not for what they think I should be." In college, Serena was no longer the girl from Macon. She was the scholarship student walking into lecture halls filled with wealth and privilege. She was the only black woman in her economics seminar, the only one professors seemed to question twice as hard. There were nights she sat alone in the library, exhausted, wondering if it was worth it. But then she would pull out a worn slip of paper her mother had tucked into her bag before she left home. In neat cursive, it read, "When you feel small, remember you carry all of us with you." That note became her anchor. Decades later, she still carried it, folded into the back of her leather wallet, at airports, at board meetings, during negotiations. She would sometimes slip her hand into the pocket and feel the worn paper. It reminded her that every insult, every dismissal, every boarding pass torn in half wasn't just hers to bear. It was the echo of generations. Serena opened her eyes again in row 14. The cabin had gone quiet, the engines low as they prepared for takeoff. But her mind was still weaving through the past. Each memory carried both sting and strength. And she realized something important. The humiliation at Gate C-17 wasn't an isolated wound. It was the latest cut in a lifetime of cuts. But like the others, it would harden into armor. Her phone buzzed with another message from David Ross. "Need me to initiate legal review now." She typed back a single word. "Wait." She needed the timing to be perfect. Her gaze drifted to Rachel Kim again. The young woman's phone was angled discreetly, recording the hum of the cabin. Rachel's eyes met hers with quiet solidarity. Serena wondered if Rachel, too, carried her own battles, the silent dismissals, the sideways glances. Everyone carried something, but not everyone had the power to turn their pain into leverage. Serena did. She remembered her first corporate job interview in New York, decades earlier. She had walked into a polished conference room, resume crisp, heart-pounding. The hiring manager, a man in a tailored suit, hadn't looked up as he asked, "So who mentored you into getting this far?" The assumption, unspoken but heavy, was that she could not have arrived on merit. She had left the interview, sat on a bench outside the building, and for a long moment thought about giving up. But then she thought of her father tapping his temple, her mother's note in her wallet. She had gotten up, walked into another building, another interview, and landed the job that became her first rung on the ladder. Now, sitting in 14C, she realized her life had been a series of gates. At each one, someone had tried to block her path. At each one, she had pushed through. The difference today was that she was no longer the girl carrying only her own hopes. She was the CEO of a company poised to acquire Aurora Airlines. She carried leverage, influence, and the quiet fire of experience. The captain's voice boomed overhead, announcing takeoff. Serena placed her hands on her knees, steady, inside her chest. Her heart carried a rhythm she knew well, fear and determination, braided together. This wasn't just another insult, it was a test, and she intended to pass it. The plane lifted off, engines roaring, pressing passengers back into their seats. Serena closed her eyes once more, but this time her memories didn't sting. They sharpened. Each humiliation, each dismissal, each whispered doubt, they were not scars. They were stepping stones. And now, they were about to become evidence. In 30 minutes, she would make her move. The girl from Macon, Georgia, who had once been told she didn't belong in a classroom, who had once left a diner in silence, who had once been called good for where she comes from, was now preparing to remind an entire airline exactly who she was. The fire in her chest no longer flickered, it burned steady. The storm was coming, and Serena Caldwell was ready to unleash it. The plane steadied at cruising altitude, and the cabin lights dimmed to a muted glow. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, offering water and snacks. Their practiced smiles stretched thin. In row 14, Serena Caldwell sat motionless, her body upright, her face calm. To the casual eye, she looked like any other passenger adjusting to the rhythm of the flight. But beneath the calm surface, her thoughts ran deep and relentless, threading past and future together. The silence around her was heavy. Passengers avoided looking directly at her, yet she could feel their glances sliding over her like invisible weights. To them, she wasn't simply another traveler, she was a story unfolding in real time. Phones had recorded the moment her pass was torn. Whispers had passed along the rows. She knew by now that several passengers were already reliving the humiliation through replayed clips on their screens, quietly trading outrage or skepticism. The man seated beside her scrolled through his phone, pretending not to notice her. Across the aisle, Rachel Kim's phone lay face down on her tray, though her posture betrayed the tension of someone who had witnessed injustice and didn't know what to do next. The faint hum of engines filled the void, where voices might have been, amplifying the silence until it felt like a verdict. Serena breathed slowly, pressing her palms together in her lap. She had endured silences like this before, the kind that follow when a room full of people watches you but refuses to acknowledge your worth. In corporate meetings, when her ideas were met with blank stares until a man repeated them. At social events, where introductions skipped over her name as though she were invisible. Silence, she had learned, could be as cutting as any insult. This silence, though, was different. It was a silence waiting for her response. She turned her gaze toward the oval window, watching clouds drift beneath them. Out there, the sky stretched wide, unbothered by human pettiness. But inside, the air was taut. She thought of how humiliation narrowed the world, shrank it until all that existed was the sting of being told you didn't belong. She refused to let her world shrink. Her phone buzzed softly in her tote. She pulled it out with deliberate calm. A new message blinked on the screen. It was from David Ross again. Pressing issue. FAA compliance officer on standby if you need him looped in. She hesitated for a moment, letting her thumb hover above the screen. Not yet. Timing was everything. A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was a flight attendant, pausing by her row. "Would you like something to drink?" Ma'am Serena lifted her eyes. The young man wore a tentative expression, as though he wasn't sure if serving her would invite conflict. His voice carried none of the scorn of Monica Hale, but it held unease. "Water, please," Serena said, her tone even kind. He nodded, returning moments later with a small cup, condensation beading on its sides. She accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." The exchange was ordinary, almost mundane, but it highlighted the contrast between cruelty and decency. Not everyone sought to humiliate her. Some people were simply caught in the current, unsure of where to stand. It was a reminder that change wasn't just about punishing the cruel. It was about giving the decent space to act with courage. She took a sip of water, feeling the coolness anchor her. The plane continued to glide through the air, and her mind sank deeper into reflection. She thought about the merger waiting back in Manhattan, about the long hours she had poured into negotiations, the careful balance of strategy and diplomacy. She had always believed that progress came from patience, from persistence, from staying at the table long after others had walked away. But patience had its limits. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she recalled Victor Langston's name. He was Aurora Airlines Vice President of Operations. The man she suspected had engineered this insult. Victor was known for his disdain toward change, toward diversity initiatives, toward the very reforms Serena championed. If he was behind the manual override of her seat assignment, this was no accident. This was a calculated message. The thought sent a low current of fire through her veins. She placed her cup back on the tray, folding her hands together once more. The silence around her no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a stage being set. Across the aisle, Rachel Kim shifted slightly. Their eyes met again. Serena saw the flicker of resolve in the young woman's gaze. Rachel picked up her phone and, with a subtle nod, mouthed, "I have proof." Serena inclined her head just barely, acknowledging the gesture. It was enough. The pieces were aligning. Minutes stretched, the hum of the engine steady as a heartbeat. Serena let the rhythm guide her breathing. She felt her doubts rising. Was she prepared to bring an entire airline to a halt? The faces of stranded passengers flashed in her imagination. Families in terminals, workers rushing to jobs, students flying home. The collateral damage of her decision would be real. Her inner voice whispered, "Perhaps endure this one quietly. Perhaps not every battle must be fought." But another voice, stronger, cut through. It was her father's again, echoing from the past. Standing steady, Serena, means knowing when silence is no longer strength, but surrender. She straightened her shoulders. This was no longer about one torn boarding pass. It was about the culture of an airline that thought humiliation could be weaponized. If she stayed silent, others would suffer the same treatment. Silence was complicity. Her phone buzzed once more. This time she didn't hesitate. She opened her secure folder, scrolled to David Ross's number, and pressed her thumb firmly against the call icon. She would not place the call yet, but she held it ready, her thumb steady, as though testing her own resolve. A deep calm spread through her chest. She had been underestimated too many times, dismissed too easily. What Aurora Airlines didn't realize was that every slight, every insult, had sharpened her like a blade. She looked down at the torn halves of her boarding pass resting inside her bag. Evidence, symbol, catalyst, soon. The silence in this cabin would be shattered by something far louder, the grounding of an entire airline. For now, she sat in stillness, her calm presence belying the storm about to be unleashed. And in that silence, she no longer felt humiliation. She felt control. The cabin was calm, But Serena Caldwell's mind was sharpening like a blade. She rested her phone lightly in her palm. The screen dimmed to preserve its charge, while the torn boarding pass lay hidden in her tote bag. Around her, passengers sipped sodas, rustled through magazines, and scrolled their feeds. To them, this was just another flight. To Serena, it was a battlefield wrapped in clouds. She opened her laptop carefully, shielding the screen from wandering eyes. The hum of the engines masked the faint click of keys as she logged into her company's encrypted server. The connection tunneled silently through layers of security, invisible to the in-flight Wi-Fi monitoring system. Within seconds, she was inside the same infrastructure Aurora Airlines depended on for its daily operations. Her company, Caldwell Dynamics, had been contracted as part of the upcoming merger to modernize Aurora's data systems. What Victor Langston and his allies didn't realize was that Serena already had a secure window into those systems. She didn't need permission to see the truth. She had built the scaffolding that held their operations together. Her fingers moved with precision. She navigated to the seat allocation logs for Flight 782. Rows of entries filled the screen: passenger names, ticket classes, digital timestamps. At first glance, everything seemed routine, but Serena knew how to read between the lines. She spotted her name: Caldwell, Serena M., and froze. The entry for her seat assignment had been altered 30 minutes before boarding. A manual override. Her original seat, 1A, had been reassigned to another passenger, a man named Daniel Whitmore, listed as Platinum Elite. The system note read, "Authorized by Langston Ops." Her stomach clenched. There it was. Proof. Victor Langston hadn't left fingerprints, but he had left initials. The override was routed through a shadow account linked to operations. It wasn't just Monica Hale acting on bias. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, orchestrated from higher up. Serena stared at the screen, a mix of anger and grim satisfaction rising in her chest. Rachel Kim leaned slightly across the aisle, pretending to adjust her seatbelt. Her lips mouthed a question. "You okay?" Serena gave a brief nod, closing her laptop halfway. She couldn't afford to draw attention. Not yet. Inside her chest, the debate began again. Should she pull the trigger now? A single call to David Ross and the FAA would set off a cascade: flights grounded, executives scrambling, headlines erupting. But her strategist's mind cautioned her. Timing was everything. Too soon, and they could spin it as a misunderstanding. Too late, and Victor could bury the evidence. She decided to wait until they landed. 30 minutes of patience could shift the balance from personal humiliation to corporate crisis. Still, she couldn't silence the sting of what she had uncovered. She thought back to the long hours she'd spent negotiating this merger, the late nights in glass-walled offices, the endless reviews of contracts, the quiet hope that Aurora Airlines could become something better under her leadership. And now, to discover that one of its highest officers had weaponized its systems against her. It was more than betrayal. It was a declaration of war. She closed her laptop gently and leaned back in her seat. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the darkened window. For a moment, she saw not herself, but the girl from Macon, Georgia. The girl told to wait her turn. The girl forced to leave a diner in silence. That girl had grown into a woman who now held the power to ground an airline. The symmetry of it made her chest tighten. The flight attendant returned, collecting cups. His eyes lingered on her a moment too long, as though he wanted to apologize for something he hadn't done. Serena gave him a kind smile, easing his discomfort. Not everyone on this plane was her enemy, but some were watching closely, and she could sense it. A few rows ahead, a man in a tailored blazer glanced back at her more than once. His posture was too stiff, his interest too measured. Serena's instincts flared. She recognized the type, a corporate plant, perhaps even someone sent by Langston himself to keep tabs. Aurora was notorious for monitoring high-profile passengers, and Serena, whether they admitted it or not, was among the highest. She didn't break eye contact. Instead, she let her expression remain calm, almost indifferent, as if to say, "I see you, and I'm not afraid." The man shifted uncomfortably and turned back toward the front. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't David Ross. It was an encrypted message from Ethan Morales, an engineer who had quietly reached out months ago. Ethan had hinted at systemic corruption inside Aurora's operations team. She hadn't known then whether to trust him fully, but his timing now was uncanny. The message read, "Dr. Caldwell, Langston is moving fast. He's purging logs. If you need proof, pull now." Serena's pulse quickened. She opened her laptop again, fingers flying as she accessed deeper layers of the system. Ethan was right. The override logs were already flagged for deletion, set to expire within the hour. Langston wasn't careless. He was ruthless. He wanted no trace left of what had happened at Gate C-17. She copied the logs into her own encrypted drive, adding timestamps and authentication markers that would stand up in court. When she was finished, she leaned back once more, exhaling slowly. She had the proof. Langston had played his hand, and she had captured it. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight attendants prepared for descent. Serena glanced at her watch. 28 minutes to landing. 28 minutes until she would make the call that turned this humiliation into reckoning. She thought of her parents again. Her father, who had taught her that power wasn't shouting, but standing steady. Her mother, who had written those words on the slip of paper she still carried. "When you feel small, remember you carry all of us with you." Tonight, she would carry not just her parents, but every passenger who had been silenced, dismissed, or humiliated. Her phone buzzed once more. Rachel Kim had sent her an airdrop message, just a single video file. Serena opened it and saw herself at the gate, standing tall while Monica Hale ripped her boarding pass in two. Gas echoed, Monica's voice dripping with disdain. "First class isn't for people like you." The video was short, sharp, undeniable. Paired with the system logs, it was more than evidence. It was truth, laid bare. Serena felt a steady calm wash over her. The humiliation was no longer hers alone. It belonged to a story bigger than herself. And when she landed, the world would see it. She closed her laptop, slipped her phone back into her bag, and folded her hands once more. To any observer, she was just a passenger waiting for descent. But inside, she was preparing to strike a blow that would ripple through boardrooms, newsrooms, and households across the country. Victor Langston thought he had humiliated her. He had no idea he had just armed her. The wheels of Flight 782 touched down on the tarmac with a dull thud, and the cabin lurched forward as brakes engaged. Passengers stirred awake. Seatbelts clicked, bags rustled overhead. For them, landing was routine, a step toward their destinations. Family reunions, business meetings, homecomings. For Serena Caldwell, it was the moment everything shifted. She gripped her phone in one hand, her other hand resting calmly over the tote that concealed the torn boarding pass and the copied system logs. She wasn't rushing to stand as others did. She remained seated, eyes half closed, feeling the vibration of the slowing engines beneath her feet. The hum carried a strange resonance. It sounded like the prelude to a storm. The captain's voice came overhead, steady and cheerful. "Welcome to Atlanta. Please remain seated until we reach the gate." The usual script. Serena let it wash over her, then unlocked her phone. She scrolled to David Ross's number and pressed call. The line picked up almost instantly. "Serena." David's voice was brisk, urgent. "Are you safe?" "Yes," she said. Calm but firm. "But Aurora Airlines is not." She gave him the essentials in clipped, precise sentences. The manual override in the seat system, the initials pointing to Langston, the purge of the logs Ethan had warned about, and finally, the video Rachel Kim had shared. "I need escalation now." She finished, "FO, Department of Transportation, and our board. Within 30 minutes, Aurora must be frozen in place, grounded." There was silence on the line. Then David exhaled. "Consider it done. You're aware what this means. It's not just a flight delay. It's the entire airline." "I'm aware," Serena said softly. "This is bigger than one seat. They've made it systemic. I won't let them bury it." When she ended the call, she felt the shift inside her chest. The humiliation that had burned in Gate C-17 no longer weighed her down. It had become fuel, pushing her forward. Around her, passengers began filing out, shuffling toward the exit. She stood slowly, pulling her tote over her shoulder. Rachel Kim caught her eye, lifted her phone slightly, then gave a small nod. Serena answered with the faintest smile. Their alliance was wordless but unbreakable. As she stepped into the jet bridge, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a secure message from David. FAA directive issued. Aurora operations suspended pending investigation. Effective immediately. Serena paused mid-step. The words seemed to echo louder than the murmur of passengers around her. It was done. 30 minutes after she had made the call, Aurora Airlines, the giant that had dared to humiliate her, was frozen on the ground. Flights nationwide were halted, terminals flooded with confusion, and all of it began with the torn paper now folded in her tote. The terminal in Atlanta was buzzing with routine life, but beneath it, Serena could sense the shift. Airline employees scurried with clipped urgency, their radios crackling louder than usual. A supervisor barked orders into a headset, his face pale. Travelers lined up at gates where boarding should have begun, only to be met with apologies and shrugs. Word hadn't spread yet, but Serena knew it would. She walked through the concourse with measured steps, her presence calm, her expression unreadable. To onlookers, she was just another business traveler moving between gates. But inside, she carried the weight of an entire industry shifting under her hands. Her phone rang again. It was David. "They're panicking," he said. "Langston's trying to spin it as a glitch, but we've secured the logs. FAA is reviewing already. And Serena, the media's caught wind. Rachel Kim's video is circulating. It's viral." Serena stopped by a wide window overlooking the runway. Planes sat motionless, lined like silent witnesses. "Let them see," she murmured. "Let the world see." The quiet resolve in her voice carried more force than anger ever could. She thought back to Monica Hale's smirk at the gate, the ripping sound of paper, the phrase dripping with disdain. "First class isn't for people like you." Now the irony burned bright. Because of that single act, the entire airline was paralyzed. Because of that humiliation, Serena's power had crystallized. As she stood there, passengers nearby began muttering, pointing at their phones. She overheard snippets. All flights delayed. What's happening? They said the airline's grounded. Confusion spread like wildfire. And then, from another corner of the concourse, someone gasped audibly, "Wait, isn't that her?" The woman from the video heads turned. Serena felt the weight of eyes again, but this time it was different. Not pity, not contempt, recognition. The silence shifted into something heavier, something collective. Rachel Kim appeared at her side, almost out of breath. "They're saying you did this," Rachel whispered. "That you grounded the airline." Serena tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not me. The truth did." Rachel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. There was respect there now, even awe. Serena moved toward the exit, her phone still buzzing in her hand. A message from Ethan Morales appeared. "I'm in. I'll testify if needed. Langston can't cover this anymore." Another ally, stepping into the light. Outside the terminal, the humid Atlanta air wrapped around her. Cars honked. Shuttles rumbled past, the world continuing even as an airline froze. She inhaled deeply, letting the noise and chaos blend into the background. Her phone rang once more. This time, it was not David, but the chair of the board. His voice was clipped, alarmed, demanding answers. Serena listened quietly, then interrupted with the same calm she had carried all day. "I warned you," she said evenly. "Aurora had rotten its core. Langston has been protecting a culture that humiliates passengers, that abuses power, that thinks dignity can be torn like paper. Today you saw what that culture costs. If you want this company to survive, you let me rebuild it. From the ground up." There was a pause. Then the chair's voice softened, almost reluctant. "You'll have what you need. Langston is finished." Serena ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag. She stood still for a moment, gazing across the tarmac where planes sat idle, grounded not by storms, but by justice. She thought again of her mother's words on that fragile slip of paper. "When you feel small, remember you carry all of us with you." For the first time that day, Serena allowed herself to exhale fully. She didn't just carry her parents anymore. She carried every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And now, because of her, an entire system had been forced to reckon with that truth. The humiliation at Gate C-17 was no longer a wound. It was history. And history, Serena Caldwell knew, was always written by those who refused to be silent. By the time Serena Caldwell stepped into her Blacktown car, waiting outside the Atlanta terminal, the storm had already begun. Her driver, a quiet man named Louis, glanced nervously at the radio dial. The station that usually hummed soft jazz was cutting into breaking news. All Aurora Airlines flights have been suspended nationwide, pending an investigation into alleged misconduct by senior management. Sources say the suspension is tied to an incident involving Dr. Serena Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, and a first-class boarding dispute earlier today. Louis adjusted the volume lower, stealing a glance in the rearview mirror. "Ma'am," he said softly, "they're talking about you on every channel." Serena slid into the seat, her tote beside her, and nodded. "I expected as much." She pulled out her phone. Notifications cascaded across the screen, articles flashing her name, hashtags exploding. Grounded by truth. Seat for Serena. Aurora exposed. Clips of Monica Hale ripping the boarding pass had already been viewed millions of times. Rachel Kim's video had struck a nerve. The words, "First class isn't for people like you," cut across screens with brutal clarity. There was no mistaking the intent. No corporate spin could erase the disdain in Monica's tone, nor could anyone deny the quiet dignity in Serena's face as she stood unmoved. Inside the car, Serena's phone buzzed with calls. She didn't answer reporters, board members, colleagues. She only answered one, David Ross. "They're in full collapse mode," David said, voice crackling with both urgency and satisfaction. "FAA is pressing for immediate compliance records. DOT wants to review discrimination complaints, and Serena Langston's name is already surfacing. Employees are whispering, 'The logs you pulled are gold.'" Serena listened, her gaze drifting out the window at the glowing Atlanta skyline. "They'll try to protect themselves first," she said. "Langston will scramble. The board will bargain. The media will twist. But we stay steady. Truth doesn't need to shout." David's chuckle was short, weary. "Steady is what you do best." She ended the call and leaned back against the leather seat. A flash of memory pierced through the smirk on Monica's face, the sound of paper tearing. That humiliation was now a headline. Yes, but it was also something deeper. It had tapped into a collective memory for thousands who had been told in subtle or blunt ways, "You don't belong here." That was why the story spread so quickly. It wasn't just about Serena Caldwell. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, downgraded, humiliated because of who they were. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Ethan Morales. Employees scared, but hopeful. "Many want to talk. Langston's hold is cracking." Serena allowed herself a small smile. Ethan was risking everything, but he was no longer alone. The cracks were widening. Back in New York, the media firestorm had already overtaken evening news. Anchors debated whether Aurora Airlines could survive. Some painted Serena as a hero, others as a disruptor too powerful for comfort. Commentators dissected every second of the viral clip, freezing on her calm face as if searching for clues. Meanwhile, Aurora's board scrambled. Internal emails leaked almost immediately, directors blaming each other, executives drafting empty statements about technical glitches and unfortunate misunderstandings. But the video drowned them out. The public wasn't buying excuses. By the time Serena's car pulled up to her hotel in downtown Atlanta, the street outside was swarming with cameras. Reporters jostled, microphones thrust forward, flashes exploding in her face. Questions flew like arrows. "Dr. Caldwell, did you order the airline grounded? Was this personal revenge or corporate leverage? What do you say to passengers stranded at airports nationwide?" Serena paused at the curb, the chaos pressing in. She could have kept walking in silence, but instead, she turned to face the crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was even low, deliberate. No passenger should ever be told they don't belong. She said, not because of their color, not because of their gender, not because of where they come from. This isn't about one seat. This is about dignity. And dignity is not negotiable. For a moment, the frenzy quieted. Pens froze. Cameras clicked. But her words hung heavier than the noise. Then she moved inside, the crowd parting around her, stunned into stillness. In her hotel suite, she finally let herself breathe. She set her tote down, placed the torn boarding pass gently on the desk, and opened her laptop again. Emails poured in messages of support. Stories from strangers. A black teacher in Chicago wrote, "They told me I couldn't sit in the front row of a conference I paid for. Seeing you stand steady gave me courage." A Latina flight attendant wrote anonymously, "I've seen this culture from the inside. Thank you for exposing it." Serena read each one slowly, her chest tightening. She hadn't planned for this to become a movement, but it was already becoming one. Her phone buzzed once more, this time with an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered, "Dr. Caldwell." The voice was low, tense. "Yeah, it was Victor Langston. You don't know what you've done." Serena's silence was deliberate, letting him fill the space. "You think you've won," Langston continued, "but airlines don't ground for one person. You've made thousands, suffered delays, cancellations, chaos. The public will turn on you, and when they do, your empire will crumble." Her reply was calm, measured. "No, Victor, they won't turn on me. They'll turn on the people who thought humiliation was policy. People like you." The line went dead. Serena placed the phone down gently. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She had been threatened before, but tonight, she knew something Langston didn't. Truth had momentum, and once it started rolling, it didn't stop. She walked to the window, gazing down at the lights of Atlanta flickering like a constellation. Below, cameras still crowded the entrance, waiting for another glimpse of her. Inside, she stood alone, steady as stone. The humiliation of Gate C-17 was gone. In its place stood a reckoning, unfolding faster than anyone could control. And Serena Caldwell, for all her calm, knew this was only the beginning. Morning came with little rest. Serena Caldwell sat at the desk in her hotel suite, the torn boarding pass placed neatly beside her laptop, like a relic of battle. The city outside buzzed with traffic and morning radio chatter, but inside her room, silence reigned. She had spent the night reviewing data, cross-checking Ethan Morales' files, reading through thousands of messages from strangers who saw in her story a reflection of their own wounds. The firestorm had not died overnight. It had grown. News anchors were calling it the largest consumer disruption in airline history. Hashtags linked her name with words like resilience, justice, reform. At precisely 9 a.m., her phone buzzed. It was David Ross. "The board has called an emergency session. Noon. Closed doors. They want you present." Serena adjusted her blazer, smoothing the fabric with slow, deliberate strokes. "They don't want me present," she corrected. "They need me present." When she entered the boardroom 3 hours later, the air was thick with unease. The directors of Aurora Airlines sat in a semicircle of polished mahogany, their faces drawn, their eyes restless. Some looked at her with resentment, others with fear, a few, to her surprise, with hope. Victor Langston was seated at the far end, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. The chair, a silver-haired man with trembling hands, cleared his throat. "Dr. Caldwell, thank you for joining us under these extraordinary circumstances." Serena placed her tote on the table, the torn boarding pass visible atop it. "Circumstances of your own making," she said softly. Her voice carried not anger, but certainty. It filled the room more effectively than any raised tone could have. Victor leaned forward, his voice sharp. "This is an overreach, a personal vendetta blown out of proportion. You stranded tens of thousands of passengers. Do you know the damage you've caused?" Serena met his eyes steadily. "No, Victor. You caused it when you authorized a system override to humiliate a paying customer. You caused it when you allowed discrimination to be normalized in your operations. I simply refused to stay silent." David Ross slid a folder across the table. Inside were the system logs Serena had pulled, Ethan Morales' corroborating testimony, and Rachel Kim's viral video. The evidence was undeniable. Several directors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flicking from Victor to Serena. The chair opened the folder, his face pale as he read. "Langston, Is this true? Victor slammed a fist against the table. This is fabrication. She's orchestrating this for leverage. For power, Serena's reply was measured. Power is not what I seek. Accountability is. And a culture where no one is told they don't belong. The room fell into silence. One director, a woman with steel-gray eyes, finally spoke. Dr. Caldwell, what are your terms? Serena allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before answering. First, Victor Langston is removed immediately, along with any senior staff complicit in his practices. Second, Aurora initiates an independent cultural audit overseen by a third party, not by insiders. Third, you establish a permanent equity council with authority, not just symbolism. And finally, she placed her hand on the torn boarding pass. Passengers must be given a transparent channel to report discrimination, one that bypasses the very people who would bury their voices. Victor sneered. You think you can rewrite an airline overnight? Serena leaned slightly forward, her gaze unwavering. You grounded yourself the moment you chose humiliation as policy. I'm giving you the choice to rebuild or to collapse. The chair rubbed his temple, sweat beading at his brow. If we agree, what role do you envision for yourself? Dr. Caldwell. Serena paused. The question was both expected and dangerous. She chose her words carefully. I am not here to wear your title, but I will hold your system accountable. Caldwell Dynamics will complete the merger under new terms: oversight authority on reforms, transparency in reporting, and the power to terminate contracts if changes are not implemented. If you want survival, you'll accept. Murmurs rippled through the boardroom. Some directors bristled, others nodded faintly. They all knew the truth. Without Serena's company, Aurora Airlines would crumble under regulatory weight and public fury. Victor Langston stood abruptly, pointing a finger at her. She is manipulating you. Don't you see she'll dismantle us from the inside? But his outburst only underscored his desperation. One by one, the directors turned from him to her. Finally, the chair spoke again, voice heavy with resignation. The board votes on Langston's removal, effective immediately. The vote was swift. 11 hands raised in favor. 1 Victor's against. Victor's face flushed crimson, his voice cracking with rage. You won't win, Caldwell. You've humiliated me. But this industry protects its own. Serena stood, gathering her tote. Then it's time the industry learns who it truly serves. She left the boardroom without looking back. Outside the closed doors, David caught up with her, his face alight with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. You realize what you just did. Serena's lips curved in the faintest smile. I didn't just ground an airline, David. I gave them a chance to fly differently. As they walked through the corridor, her phone buzzed again. A message from Ethan Morales employees cheering quietly. They're saying, for once, someone spoke for them. Serena stopped, reading the words twice. A warmth spread through her chest, subtle but undeniable. The humiliation at Gate C-17 had turned into something larger, something generational. She had carried her parents, her community, her past into that boardroom, and she had left carrying countless others with her. She looked at David, her voice quiet but resolute. This isn't finished. The firestorm out there, it's only the beginning. Now we rebuild. The press conference was scheduled for late afternoon, but the crowd had gathered long before. Reporters lined the marble steps of Aurora's headquarters in Manhattan, their cameras angled toward the podium flanked by the company's seal. Protesters stood just beyond the barricades, holding hastily painted signs, "Dignity is not optional," and grounded by racism. The hum of voices carried through the streets, part outrage, part anticipation. Inside a quiet holding room, Serena Caldwell stood by the window, her reflection superimposed against the skyline. She wore a dark blazer, her expression calm, but her chest rose and fell with the weight of what was about to come. This was no longer about corporate negotiations or boardroom battles. This was about facing the public, people who now saw her not only as a CEO but as a symbol. David Ross entered the room, a folder tucked under his arm. "The media is restless," he said. "They're hungry for answers. Some are calling you a hero. Others, a disruptor who put thousands of travelers in chaos." Serena turned to him, her voice steady. "Then I'll give them the truth. Not spin, not excuses, just the truth." Rachel Kim sat quietly at the corner of the room, phone in her hand. She had become an unlikely ally in this storm, her video still spreading across networks. "Dr. Caldwell," she said softly, "people are waiting to hear your voice. That video, it gave them something to hold on to. But they need more than proof now. They need direction." Serena nodded. "They'll have it." Minutes later, she stepped out into the blinding flash of cameras. The crowd surged, voices calling her name, questions thrown like darts. She approached the podium, laid her hands flat on the wood, and let the noise swell before she spoke. Her voice was low, deliberate, yet it carried to the farthest edges of the plaza. "Yesterday, I stood at Gate C17 in Newark. I held a first-class boarding pass, seat 1A. That pass was torn in half before my eyes. I was told, in front of strangers, that first class was not for people like me. And in that moment, I carried not only my own humiliation, but the echoes of millions who have been told they don't belong." The crowd hushed. Reporters leaned forward. Serena continued, her tone unflinching. "I did not ground Aurora Airlines out of revenge. I grounded them because dignity cannot be treated as optional, because humiliation is not a mistake. It is a culture, and cultures that humiliate must be confronted, not excused." Behind the barricades, a woman raised her fist, tears streaming down her face. A man clutched his daughter's hand, whispering, "Listen, this matters." Serena's eyes swept the crowd. "I am not here to punish passengers who depend on this airline. I am here to demand change, effective immediately. Aurora will undergo a cultural audit, independent and transparent. An equity council will be created with binding authority. Passengers will have a channel for their voices to be heard without fear of silence. This is not the end of the airline. This is the rebirth of one." The plaza erupted applause, cheers, shouts of support. Cameras clicked wildly. But Serena's face remained calm, her voice steady as she delivered her final words. "This is bigger than one company. It is about every place where people are told they do not belong. And to those people, I say you belong. You always have." She stepped back from the podium, flashes exploding around her. David placed a protective hand on her shoulder as security guided her inside. But Serena felt no fear. For the first time since the torn pass, she felt light. Later that evening, she sat in her hotel suite, scrolling through messages pouring in. They were not just headlines. They were human stories. A nurse in Detroit who had been denied a hotel room because the clerk didn't believe she could afford it. A black father in Dallas whose child was told to move from the front row of a classroom play. A South Asian woman in Seattle who was mistaken for staff every time she entered her own office building. Each story carried the same ache. Each story reminded Serena that this fight was not hers alone. Her phone buzzed again. It was Ethan Morales. "Employees are speaking out now," he said. his voice almost trembling with relief. Anonymous testimonies are flooding in flight attendants, ground crew, even junior managers. They're telling stories of passengers downgraded, silenced, profiled. It's like the dam has broken. Serena closed her eyes, letting the weight of it sink in. "Good," she whispered. "Truth needs air. Let it breathe." Rachel Kim knocked gently on the door before stepping in. "Dr. Caldwell, I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't know if sending you that video would change anything, but now it feels like maybe it did." Serena smiled faintly. "You trusted the truth, Rachel. That's what matters." For a moment, silence filled the room, not heavy this time, but restorative. Rachel's shoulders relaxed, and she slipped out quietly, leaving Serena with her thoughts. She walked to the desk, picked up the torn boarding pass once more, and held it against the lamplight. The paper looked fragile, but it had sparked an earthquake. She thought of her father's words. Power isn't shouting the loudest, it's standing steady. Today, she had stood steady, and in doing so, she had given others the courage to stand as well. As night fell over Manhattan, Serena stepped to the window. The city glittered with millions of lights, each one representing a life, a story, a struggle. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered softly, "You belong." For the first time in days, her shoulders eased. She wasn't just fighting a system anymore. She was healing from it and offering healing to others. The humiliation at Gate C-17 had transformed into something far more enduring, a movement rooted in human dignity. Weeks passed, but the echoes of Gate C-17 did not fade. They spread into boardrooms, classrooms, news panels, and dinner table conversations. Aurora Airlines remained grounded longer than any corporation had expected. Yet rather than collapsing entirely, something unexpected happened. The airline began to transform. Dr. Serena Caldwell had returned to her office at Sky Point Tower in Manhattan, but her days were no longer quiet. Every morning she was briefed on Aurora's progress, independent auditors combing through personnel files, anonymous hotlines ringing with stories long buried, training programs reshaped from the ground up. The Equity Council she had demanded was not a token gesture. It was real, with power to veto policies and enforce transparency. David Ross entered her office one morning, a rare smile softening his usually stern features. "They approved the Clear Horizons initiative," he said, placing a folder on her desk. "Mandatory bias training, de-escalation practices, independent oversight, all codified. It's bigger than I expected." Serena lifted the folder, scanning the lines. "Good. It's not just about saving an airline. It's about changing what flying feels like for everyone." Down the hall, her assistant patched through calls daily. Letters poured in. Parents wrote about their children watching Serena's speech and asking questions about belonging. A group of Aurora employees sent a card signed with dozens of names. "For standing up when we couldn't thank you." Rachel Kim visited often, her role evolving from witness to advocate. She had been invited onto panels to discuss bystander courage, urging others to record and report injustice when they saw it. Her voice, once hesitant, now carried conviction. "You don't have to be powerful to make change," she said on national television. "You just have to be present." Ethan Morales, the young IT engineer who had risked his career, had been quietly promoted under Aurora's restructured leadership. Serena insisted his name remain shielded publicly for his safety. But within the company, he was recognized as a turning point, the one who helped unlock the truth when fear kept others silent. And then there was Victor Langston. His name had all but disappeared from Aurora's materials, but whispers of his downfall remained. Investigations revealed a long trail of misconduct, favoritism, and bias hidden beneath spreadsheets and operational efficiency. Facing mounting evidence and public disgrace, he resigned in silence. Serena never sought his ruin, but she accepted it as the inevitable outcome of a system built on arrogance. The greatest surprise came when passengers began sharing their own stories, not of humiliation, but of healing. On social media, people posted photos boarding Aurora flights under the hashtag #JarsClearHorizons, describing staff who smiled differently, listened longer, treated them with dignity. A black veteran wrote for the first time, "I wasn't questioned about my ID. I was simply welcomed." A young mother added, "My autistic son was met with patience, not stares. Thank you." The change was fragile, yes, but it was real. One evening, Serena returned home late to her apartment overlooking the Hudson. The city shimmered with lights, the river carrying reflections like fragments of memory. She poured a glass of water and sat by the window, letting the hum of Manhattan wash over her. For weeks, she had carried herself as the steady anchor, never faltering in public, never showing the private ache of that moment at Gate C-17. But here, in the quiet, she allowed herself to feel it fully, the sting of the torn boarding pass, the humiliation that had cut deeper than paper. And she wept not from pain alone, but from release, because what had begun in humiliation had become a spark for others. The paper meant to reduce her had instead amplified thousands. The next morning, Serena attended a community forum in Harlem, not as a CEO, but as a neighbor. The auditorium was filled with families, students, workers, people who had followed her story and now wanted to share their own. An older woman stood, voice trembling as she said, "I was told at my job for years that I should stay in the back, but watching you, Dr. Caldwell, gave me the courage to demand a seat at the table." Serena clasped the woman's hands, her eyes moist. "You always had that seat," she said. "You just needed the world to stop pretending it didn't belong to you." Applause filled the room, not thunderous, but steady, like waves. Serena realized then that the true grounding of Aurora Airlines had not been about planes or gates. It had been about stopping time long enough for people to see the truth, for the world to sit still and listen. Months later, Aurora officially relaunched flights with new branding, a horizon stretching into light. On launch day, Serena boarded Flight 101 not as a disruptor or symbol, but simply as a passenger. The gate agent smiled warmly, scanning her ticket without hesitation. No raised eyebrows, no whispered doubts. Just, "Welcome aboard, Dr. Caldwell." She took her seat in 1A, the very number that had been denied to her, and fastened her belt. Across the aisle, a young black girl watched her shyly, clutching a stuffed bear. Serena leaned over and smiled. "First time flying?" she asked. The girl nodded. "My mom said it's safe now." Serena's throat tightened, but she kept her smile. "It is. You belong here." The engines roared to life as the plane lifted into the sky. Serena looked out at the horizon glowing with dawn. She thought of her parents, of the generations before her who had walked so she could sit here, who had endured so she could rise. She thought of Monica Hale's words, "People like you," and how those words had been turned inside out, reshaped into a movement that proved belonging was for everyone. For the first time since that morning in Newark, Serena allowed herself to rest. The work ahead was endless, but the course was set. Aurora Airlines, and perhaps the world beyond it, had been forced to reckon with dignity. As the plane cut through clouds, Serena closed her eyes. her hand resting lightly on the armrest. She whispered once more, to herself and to anyone listening, "We belong." In the months following Aurora Airlines' rebirth, the ripple effects stretched far beyond airports and boarding gates. What began as a single moment of humiliation at Gate C-17 became a catalyst for national reflection. News outlets still covered the technical changes at Aurora new diversity councils, transparent complaint channels, staff retraining, but the story had grown larger. It was no longer just about one airline. It was about who belonged, everywhere. Dr. Serena Caldwell found herself at the center of conversations she had never intended to lead. Universities requested her as a speaker. Civic groups invited her to forums. She appeared on evening news programs, not to bask in victory, but to remind people that the true measure of reform was not policy on paper, but lives changed in practice. Each time, she carried the same quiet presence that had steadied her in the boardroom. Calm, deliberate, resolute. One crisp autumn morning, she stood before a lecture hall at Columbia University. Students filled every seat, some even sitting on the floor. She spoke without notes. Gate C-17 was not just about me, she said. It was about every subtle look, every whispered word, every moment someone was told they did not belong. If humiliation can spread like fire, so can dignity. But dignity requires all of us to protect it. The students rose in a standing ovation, some with tears in their eyes. Serena saw her younger self reflected in their faces, the student who had once been told she was too ambitious for her background, the young woman who had doubted whether she truly had a seat at the table. Back in Harlem, community forums became regular. Serena attended not as a CEO, but as a neighbor listening to stories. A young man spoke about being profiled at a clothing store, a grandmother about being overlooked for housing. Each story deepened Serena's conviction that her fight was not a personal victory, but a collective journey. David Ross remained by her side, navigating the unending requests, the new contracts, the delicate balance of corporate reform and human healing. One evening in her office, he said, "You realize, Serena, you've become more than a CEO. You've become a voice people trust when everything else feels scripted." Serena looked at him, her expression softened by weariness and gratitude. "I don't want to be their voice. David, I want to remind them they already have one." Rachel Kim continued her unexpected evolution too. The shy passenger who once nervously recorded a video now spoke boldly at conferences about allyship. She launched a small nonprofit teaching bystander courage, training ordinary people to respond when they witnessed injustice. "I was just holding my phone," Rachel said in one interview. But even that mattered. We don't have to be heroes to make a difference. We just have to notice and care. Ethan Morales, still cautious but steadier, became a symbol inside Aurora of what it meant to speak truth to power. His whistleblower testimony, once hidden in fear, was now honored in training sessions as an example of integrity. When younger staff asked him how he had found the courage, Ethan simply said, "I saw someone refuse humiliation. I couldn't stay silent after that." Even passengers felt the shift. A survey showed higher trust in Aurora's staff than in any other airline. But more importantly, personal stories filled social feeds people welcomed warmly. Misunderstandings resolved with empathy. Disabled travelers accommodated without hesitation. A Latina single mother wrote, "For once, I didn't have to explain why I belonged in first class. They just treated me like I did." Not every reaction was positive. Of course. Some critics accused Serena of overreaching, of destabilizing an industry for personal gain. Commentators argued the grounding had cost millions, inconvenienced countless families. But Serena never engaged in debates of profit versus dignity. In interviews, she simply repeated, "No cost is greater than the cost of humiliation unchecked." Her words became a refrain, quoted in newspapers, echoed at rallies, printed on posters. One evening, Serena returned to Liberty International Airport, the place where it had all begun. She walked quietly through the terminal, unrecognized at first in her simple coat and scarf. Gate C-17 stood just as it had. But something felt different. The staff greeted passengers with warmth, their tones unhurried, their gestures inclusive. She watched as an elderly Sikh man approached the counter hesitantly, and the agent smiled, calling him sir with respect that seemed genuine. Serena felt a catch in her throat. She sat on a bench nearby, unseen, watching families board flights. A little boy tugged his mother's sleeve, pointing to the sign above the gate. Aurora Airlines, Clear Horizons program. The mother bent down and whispered, "That means everyone belongs. Sweetheart." Serena closed her eyes, the words sinking deep. She had grounded an airline. Yes, but in doing so, she had helped people reimagine what belonging looked like. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her father's old friend, a pastor who had watched her speech on television. "Your parents would be proud. You didn't just demand a seat, you gave others the courage to sit beside you." Tears blurred her vision as she typed back, "I carried them with me." Later that night, back in her apartment overlooking the river, Serena reflected on the journey. She had been humiliated, threatened, doubted, but she had stood steady. And in that steadiness, she had found something stronger than power. She had found resonance. People saw themselves in her story. They found in her calm refusal the reflection of their own silent battles. She knew the work was far from over. Humiliation still lurked in countless spaces, schools, offices, hospitals. But she also knew that momentum had shifted. What had once felt like a private wound had become a public reckoning. Serena Caldwell, the black CEO denied her first-class seat, had not only grounded an airline, she had helped lift a nation's conscience, reminding it of something simple, something radical, that dignity was not negotiable, and that belonging was everyone's right. The winter sun was setting over Manhattan, staining the Hudson River with streaks of gold and rose. Serena Caldwell sat by her office window in Sky Point Tower, a mug of tea cooling beside her, the city's heartbeat pulsing below. For months, her life had been a whirlwind of press conferences, boardroom reckonings, community forums, and policy reforms. But tonight, as she watched the sky dim, she allowed herself a pause. On her desk sat the torn boarding pass, carefully pressed between glass frames. The jagged tear still split the paper down the middle, but now it looked less like a wound and more like a reminder. It had started everything not by choice, but by necessity. She had carried it from humiliation to transformation, and now it was her quiet talisman, a symbol that even broken things could spark change. The door opened gently. David Ross stepped in, coat slung over his arm. "Long day?" he asked. Serena smiled faintly. "A long season," she said. He set a folder on her desk. Aurora's quarterly numbers. Not only are they stable, they're climbing. Customer trust is at an all-time high. People are booking flights just to support the new vision. She raised her eyebrows, flipping through the pages. So the airline that once humiliated passengers is now surviving because of them. "Because of you," David corrected. "You gave them no choice but to change. And people noticed." Serena shook her head gently. "I didn't ground them for numbers. David, I grounded them for dignity." If they rise again, it should be because they chose a better way to fly. That evening, Serena attended a gala in Harlem celebrating community leaders. She had resisted the spotlight, but the organizers insisted. As she entered the hall, applause filled the room, not for her wealth or her title, but for what she had done. One by one, people approached. A young teacher said, "Because of your story, my students feel braver speaking up." A retired pilot whispered, "You reminded me why I fell in love with flying in the first place, because skies are for everyone." A mother with her daughter in tow simply said, "Thank you for proving she belongs anywhere." Serena held each hand, looked into each pair of eyes, and realized that her story had ceased to be her own. It belonged to all who had been diminished, dismissed, or doubted. Later, Rachel Kim joined her at the table, her presence now confident, her shoulders squared. "I'm leaving my corporate job," Rachel said. "I'm going full-time with the nonprofit. We're calling it the Witness Project, teaching people to respond, record, and resist injustice when they see it." Serena's eyes warmed. "You've taken your one act of courage and multiplied it." Rachel laughed softly. "I had to. I couldn't just watch anymore. Not after seeing what one video could do." At another table, Ethan Morales sat quietly, smiling awkwardly as colleagues congratulated him. He was no longer the hidden IT engineer, but a recognized leader of integrity inside Aurora. Serena caught his eye across the room and raised her glass. He returned the gesture, his gratitude unspoken but unmistakable. The gala ended with a choir singing an old spiritual, voices lifting in harmony. Serena closed her eyes, the words threading through her like a prayer. When the last note faded, the audience rose together, not for performance, but for unity. That night, walking home beneath the clear winter sky, Serena thought of her parents, her father's deep voice reminding her, "Power isn't shouting the loudest, it's standing steady." Her mother's gentle insistence that she never shrink herself to fit another's comfort. They had not lived to see this moment, but she carried them in every step. Weeks later, Serena returned one final time to Liberty International Airport. She walked unaccompanied through the familiar halls until she reached Gate C-17. The gate looked ordinary, bustling with travelers, but to her it was sacred ground. She sat quietly on a bench, unnoticed among the crowd. A family laughed as they pulled carry-ons. A couple whispered excitedly about their honeymoon. A young man nervously clutched his passport. Life moved on, ordinary and extraordinary. The gate agent, a young woman with kind eyes, approached an elderly black couple waiting nearby. "Can I help you with your bags?" she asked warmly. The couple nodded, surprised by the care. Oh, Serena watched, her heart tightening with something like relief. This was what change looked like, not headlines, but everyday dignity. She stood, walked slowly to the boarding counter, and traced her fingers over the metal edge. The agent looked up, smiling. "Good afternoon. Ma'am, flying today." Serena shook her head, her voice soft. "Just passing through." She left without another word, stepping back into the stream of travelers. Months later, her story was taught in business schools as a case study on ethical leadership, cited in law journals as a turning point in corporate accountability, remembered by ordinary people as the day one woman refused to shrink before humiliation. But for Serena Caldwell, it was never about legacy. It was about belonging. One spring morning, she visited a classroom in Brooklyn. Children crowded around, eager to meet the woman they had seen on television. A little girl raised her hand shyly and asked, "Dr. Caldwell, How did you know you were strong enough? Serena crouched down so her eyes met the girl's. I didn't know, she said gently. I only knew I couldn't stay silent. And sometimes, that's what strength looks like. The girl smiled, her eyes wide with wonder. Serena touched her shoulder lightly, and in that moment, she saw the future not in airlines or policies, but in small voices learning they belonged before anyone could tell them otherwise. As she left the classroom, sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the children in warmth. Serena paused at the door, watching them laugh, their futures unwritten, their horizons clear. She stepped outside, breathing in the fresh spring air. The sky above stretched wide and endless, and for the first time in a long while, she felt not the weight of what had been, but the hope of what could be. She whispered the words she had carried from the gate to the boardroom, from humiliation to hope, we belong. And as the city around her pulsed with life, she knew those words would carry far beyond her own voice, becoming part of something larger, something lasting, a horizon of hope for everyone, at its heart. Serena Caldwell's story reminds us of one timeless truth. Dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. The humiliation she endured at that airport gate was not unique. Millions have known the sting of being told they don't belong. But what set Serena apart was her refusal to stay silent. Instead of reacting with anger or retreating in shame, she stood steady and used her voice to turn a private wound into a public reckoning. For older viewers who have lived through decades of social change, this story echoes familiar struggles. Many of us have been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed simply because of who we are. Serena's choice shows us that standing firm in moments of injustice can ripple outward, forcing even the largest systems to change. Her courage was not loud, but it was unshakable, and that made all the difference. The lesson is simple yet profound. When you carry yourself with dignity, you give others permission to do the same. And when one voice refuses to be silenced, it can inspire countless others to speak. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, if it made you reflect, or if it reminded you of your own journey, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of justice, dignity, and resilience to light. Together, we can keep these voices alive.